Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to join us live or even recorded for this session with Act Zero and IntiGrow. We've teamed up, given the times, to offer a free assessment for ransomware readiness. And we're going to talk to you about why you need to do that and how this demonstrates a lot of key aspects of your security program that may have gone overlooked. Today, we're going to cover basically the role of identity and access management and what that plays in ransomware protection. We're going to talk about how to manage the effectiveness of threat detection and response services and why some assessment strategies basically fail to create an accurate roadmap and give you a false sense of security. Before we get started here, I just want to give everybody a heads up on the interface. We have a couple tabs at the bottom here, the questions tab. This is your opportunity to ask myself and our expert on identity, Jim, any questions you want throughout the presentation. We're going to be collecting those questions, and then at the end, we'll be answering those. There's also an attachments tab. We're trying to give you guys as much collateral as we can to help your defenses. So check out our attachments, our leave behinds here. And of course, our third button, rate and feedback, all right? Make sure that you tell us what you thought. Don't hold back. We want to give you the best content we can, the best information we can, be present, be useful. So feel free to let us know what worked and what didn't so we can refine and give you the stuff you need. So we'll just launch into it. Quick note about the agenda. Going to give you a quick introduction to both of us and give you a little bit about our backgrounds. We're then going to talk about the attacker objectives and how to measure and look at the means they use to infiltrate your network ransomware, and why identity and, of course, these ransomware protections with MDR are very important, and how to assess those with these free assessments we're talking about today. We're going to cover some of the major problems in identity sprawl and mutation as part of a zero trust architecture. And then we're going to talk about what happens when those proactive measures sort of fail, right? On game day when you're actually under attack. What are the breakout stages? What are some of the things the attackers and the defenders get wrong about the testing methodologies in their internal environments after setting some of these systems up? So we're going to get into the assessments, and then we're going to talk about resources that we're going to leave behind about the assessments and open it up for Q&A. So thank you so much for joining us. Jim, why don't you give us a bit of a background about yourself and IntiGrow?
Sure. Yeah, I've been in cybersecurity compliance and risk management since I can remember, back into the 90s. Been fortunate to work with private sector organizations, along with several public sector organizations in several governments, but clearly, certainly in the U.S. one as well. I have the luxury of being able to collaborate and speak with folks at a lot of regional industry events and things like that. And really, myself and I think our entire team have a, kind of real passion for solving client challenges, especially in the scenario, that the world is currently in. We're in kind of an unprecedented time frame. We're seeing things we've never seen before. We have quantum on the horizon. There are so many issues and discussion points today that really, our goal is to, I think really be hopefully somewhat of a trusted advisor for folks, merely sharing the bumps on our heads, as we like to say, and things that we've seen over the course of the last few decades with hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations. So, yeah, that's kind of the quick and dirty, I guess, Adam, if you will.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, people on the call today, we want to be able to leverage Jim as much as possible and the team at IntiGrow. We're excited about this partnership to bring this assessment out. So please feel free to ask questions about identity. It's a big, long, complex project, concept. So we want to make sure that, we're leveraging the time as much as we can today. A bit about myself. If you've watched other webinars about us, you've probably seen me before. The CISO at Act Zero here. I've been building security operations centers. We put 15 plus years, but I've been doing this since 2005. And the concept is that, before these times, it was, just sort of defense contractors in very specialist areas that you had to build these very advanced SOCs to protect against APTs, advanced persistent threats. And now everyone has to do that because we're finding ways through, obviously, things like Bitcoin and extraterritorial laws to infiltrate small to medium networks, which is where a lot of the focus over at Act Zero is on managing detection and response. So I'm going to be covering how our ransomware readiness assessment works, the kinds of tests you want to do on your block rate, dwell time, signal to noise. We're going to cover that in just a bit, but that's who I am. So feel free to ask me any questions about hey, is my AV any good or not? And I'll be able to explain how and why it isn't or is. So let's get into it. Attacker objectives, measures, and means, right? What should we be looking at in terms of blocking attacks, and how should we be looking at the means that they use to change them, right? The premise of this talk, the hypothesis here, is that obviously attackers are changing their techniques constantly, right? You look at the quantum group, different than Revil, DarkSide, other types of methods of getting into a different environments, right? You look at Felina very recently after this. This talk is probably the closest thing after Black Cat to these ransomware campaigns. And while they get cute names, and maybe they don't have cute names, or just APT29, the concept is that they're different in a few ways, right? They're different in the methods that they change in order to infiltrate these networks, right? And then once they're in, the concept is the most important thing we can try to cut back is dwell time. How much time do they have to keep modifying and to keep changing and to keep access that modifies itself to infiltrate our environment, regardless of what we put in place, right? We want to get them out as quickly as possible, and make it very frustrating for these teams to stay in our networks and get access to our system. So the dwell time is a very key measure here, right? So they're going to change tactics. There's going to be some dwell time we want to cut back. And then we're going to understand the role of identity here, because I think it goes very overlooked, right? The path of least resistance for these attackers is to leverage privileged access, is to leverage admin credentials, is to leverage, underutilized service accounts, other accounts that give them access to systems and don't trip any wires, right? And so, the way that they get these credentials, the way they can use these credentials, that's what we're going to ask Jim about and the team at IntiGrow in our assessments. How do we make sure that we're positioned properly to minimize the impact from that kind of issue, right? And of course, there's a lot of different issues in cybersecurity. You hear all the time about different methodologies, different ways that new companies or different companies can protect you, right? Tried, true, and traditional ransomware. The concept that there's going to be an encryption of files on your disks, and they're going to try to hold you for extortion, money, to get those systems back, is what we're talking about today, right? Not the overarching data exfiltration and other extortion techniques. Just getting on a system and encrypting it and holding you ransom, right? So we're going to pivot right now to that bullet number 3, the identity sprawl, the mutation problem that is plaguing many companies in terms of protecting their credentials. And I'll pass it over to Jim to explain just what this problem is and how the assessment's going to solve it.
Okay. No, thanks, Adam. So I think everybody probably sees these days that their identities are sprawling in a very large way. Even folks with simple kind of what I would call star schema infrastructure are finding that, we're not only worried about, like, say, an instance of AD, and we're just worried about on-prem applications, and we're provisioning users in the way that we used to. And, we used to actually use, even for the attributes involving, kind of the essence of each user, we used to use social security numbers, employee ID numbers, and everything else. Obviously, we've evolved over the time, right? So now we have to worry about IoT devices. We have to worry about mobile devices. We have to worry about identities being stored in the cloud. We have to worry about being federated IDPs and IDRs and all kinds of things. So the world has gotten way more complex. So it's gone from kind of, simple scenario where we weren't doing mergers and acquisitions and all kinds of things, to scenarios where we have to worry about how we're taking on new organizations, new applications, new roles, new attack surfaces, and the like. So it's gotten vastly more complex. The other thing is that over the years, things have mutated. So people that had, even mainframe RACF or ACF2 or multiple AD farts that they've, kind of decommissioned. By the way, it's amazing how many people still live those test environments with access to the internet. So that's another best practice discussion. But the bottom line is, it's easy to let that mutate over time and to not take care of what's occurred in the past. And that's been the case in many, many situations where people, kind of are afraid maybe to get rid of sort of the forests or, certain instances that were out there previously, but still, kind of exist today, even though we've really changed what that governance and who the current, identity users truly are. So it's difficult, and it takes a lot of discipline and diligence and workflow to ensure that this doesn't happen. One of the things we'll talk a little about today, too, is the importance of privileged access management, including solutions and identity solutions, aside from, just kind of the identity store LDAP providers. So that's, as we can see, it's not getting simpler over time. We're now worried about user and application permissions. So, and again, oftentimes we'll want to authenticate a user to a cloud application in just as simple a process as we'll want to do that to a network-based application or standard web application that they log into. So it's getting a little more complex from an identity schema perspective as well. And we also need to worry about APIs that we're plugging into things, local endpoint privileges, because obviously we've deploy things in a very different way than we used to and provision users. We have to also worry about governance with account level settings, and all this takes, and obviously group policy. All this takes a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, and a lot of change, as times go along, because we're always adding or decommissioning things. They all contribute, really, but when we're undisciplined and unable to get that exactly right and don't have, processes that we would like to have, obviously the visibility becomes lower. And this is just one statement I like to make, but AD cannot necessarily be your authoritative source or your single source of truth, right? And those that have had to deal with compliance issues and things, I think kind of know what I'm talking about, especially when you might have Linux assets or Unix assets, or even some LDAS 400 assets or whatever you might have out there. So.
Thanks, Jim. I want to bring up obviously the probably most used word in even network. I think it was spawned by John Kindervag at Forrester a while back when we just had data centers, and even then we were worried about trust but verify, access every network connection and think about prompting for identity and verifying the asset and its security posture. And now as we expand, if you look at your cell phone today or your smartphone, you're going to see a whole bunch of apps, a whole bunch of identity, a whole bunch of permissions, a whole bunch of data being connected all over the place. And obviously the pandemic accelerating people going to the cloud and leveraging SaaS apps, right? So this has mutated very much in terms of what people are even expected to do as part of zero trust, right? How is the current zero trust? What are the important parts in terms of what to assess for security in our ransomware assessment, obviously, with respect to zero trust?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So if we're using, even to a degree from, say, I don't mean to keep beating on AD, so I'll try not to do that, but it's an example. So the verification, right, when someone's, logging in or authenticating, through application X, obviously we do a quick lookup in the directory in the LDAP. We look at the attributes about that person, whatever that, alphanumeric and numeric code specifically is. And there's, kind of the single verification that we've always done. In a lot of cases now, best practice, obviously these days, is to use 2FA or multi-factor authentication to generate, a token or a code or what have you. A lot of people still aren't completely doing this or on board with this. It's critical. It will cut down, your attack surface issues tremendously. It is also recommended by federal government, among others, that this is an issue that everybody needs to deal with. Many people have. We do still know people that kind of don't have this as a standard in the enterprise, and we highly recommend it. We are able to contextualize that request from the verification now, because we can now pump that user information and the log events that they're generating to SIM, to SOAR assets, and able to track and, kind of understand what that person's workflow standardly looks like and where they should really be going and where they shouldn't be going. Now, aside from that, what's very important now, and as we look at situations, like even in compliance issues now, if you're in energy, NERC and FERC, or GLBA, or SOX or HIPAA or anything else, are talking about the kill chain. And without forcing people to comply with privileged access management, this is really what they mean, right? The bottom line is we want to keep privileged users separate from a directory perspective from standard identity, because some of them are administering the identity resources, and provide a way, and I'll talk a little more about that later, but to provide a means by which they can kind of provide transparency for each other, watch and see what's going on, who's logged in, what permissions they have, what they're authenticating to, what applications they're provisioning, what network segments they're provisioning, etc. So this is kind of a last 7 or 8 year thing that is kind of really new to this. But if we have kind of our privilege act in order on the identity side, and we try to keep things simple enough, and we have the admin side kind of spoken for as well, because the days of I will have sort of overarching power and create backdoors and things like that are really getting behind us. And from a attack framework perspective, whether you're a NIST fan or a MITRE fan or whatever your favorite flavor is, this is becoming mission critical, and the discipline there is critical. And what this helps us to do is to grant least privilege. So if I've been in an organization and I've had 4 roles over, say, a decade, what most organizations aren't perfect at are reducing those roles as we go. So that's another mutation issue that people have. And I might still have access to applications, or I've heard people even say they have access to things in companies they no longer work for, that were assets that may not have been thought about. Getting to least privilege involves buttoning up all of those issues. The adaptive access control that governs all this is important as well. Today we have technologies, kind of wrapping around all of this that obviously help authenticate users in more meaningful ways. Sometimes we'll push them to 2-factor authentication if they're not there. Sometimes we'll use even tools with user entity behavior analytics, so that even if you add the same password that you've been typing in, you might do it in a different sequence or a different time frame. We'll be able to challenge that back, and it just gets more and more complex from there. But the reason really that adaptive control is really important is because obviously it keeps you safer, because if we see things we haven't seen before, we need to keep morphing, pivoting, and making that that barrier of entry smarter and more secure. The good news is as well the tools that we have today, in many cases, even the identity tools along with the privilege tools, can even work together to be able to audit things. And when I say that, it's not only being able to see the users and the activity, but it's also being able to accomplish your audit objectives. You may deal with attestation, right? Or as we call access recertification, or other items. Lots of people are sadly still doing that with a bunch of people in spreadsheets and reporting that to audit, or creating some compensatory control along those lines. But those issues are all taken care of in kind of next gen identity and privilege tools. So we'll certainly be happy to talk more about all of this later, but all of these components go into effective zero trust fundamentals. Without these, it becomes nearly impossible to kind of complete the circle, if you will. So that's just a quick 2 seconds, I guess.
Thanks, Jim. And a part of the ransomware readiness, what we're looking for in posture here, the premise of this presentation and from our experience with attacks, is that we hear a lot about zero-day vulnerabilities, remote code execution, and that being the infiltration into networks like the Hafnium group with Exchange, or a vulnerability in SolarWinds, or something else that obviously can be fixed through the patching and configuration of software. This is one of the more prevalent vulnerabilities that goes overlooked because it's not necessarily brought to the forefront, right? The whole goal of this assessment is to say that it's easier for somebody to take administrative or credentials in the environment and go undetected because it doesn't necessarily have any programmatic controls in your firewall, your antivirus, even your SIM to try to correlate the type of events that we're talking about. It gives them an unfair advantage. So the assessment really is trying to find the distance to zero trust, the distance from these adaptive controls that can contextualize the access given to an admin and make sure that if they're coming from a different workstation, a different scenario, or they're accessing things in an interesting way, a different way, if they're not segmented completely or it's offered separation of duty, then they can do a lot of damage very quickly, right? So it's essential for us to partner with IntiGrow to do this type of assessment because it's the kind of thing that can disable controls like your anti-malware program or firewalls or other types of systems geared towards finding the malware they're going to deploy after they get in. So Jim, just talk us through really quickly what that zero trust assessment is. What distance are we measuring for users with this assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are different degrees of how far teams will go along these lines. So from our perspective, best practice entails kind of a multitude of team participation, right? So this is no longer just an identity management issue. It's no longer just an access governance issue. We look at it now as, team representation being critical from the SOC. We look at it critical from obviously the identity team. Anybody who's creating custom applications really should be part of this because obviously the authentication scheme needs to be in line, kind of with the rest of the workflow here. And also anybody that's provisioning, kind of network assets out there, because we're provisioning agents, for example, to desktops and endpoints in a very similar way that we're provisioning users to applications, right? We're ensuring that people get deployed, for example, EDR, XDR, MDR, by group segment. We're making sure that we can provision users to cloud shares, to on-prem apps, as I said before, to whatever, they're gaining access to. So that team participation is really important. And the reason that I'll really emphasize that as well is we actually have friends and clients out there who have a team that are basically in the way of any application that an organization wants to onboard. And I don't mean in the way in a negative way, but what I mean is when somebody's bringing something on board, there's kind of a mini review of what that application will entail, where it will be located. We all know the importance, I think, of zone segmentation these days, right? Never giving anyone the keys to the kingdom or lateral movement. But the bottom line is that these teams can say, can gain an understanding of what the potential ramifications are. And by that, we can create what we call mean time to contain incidents. So if we're looking at a new application coming on board or a new data repository or something new from the outside or part of an acquisition, we need to understand what the potential ramifications of that asset, are. So that's why the team construct is real important. And it can be difficult sometimes for security and identity and network ops and, all these folks to work together on some of these things, but those that do benefit greatly. Part of the pre-analysis that we do really helps people to understand. We normally do this, obviously, in the last year or two remotely a great deal in a couple of sessions. But what we'll do is we'll help them to look at their topology, gain an understanding of, what is all authenticating where there are instances of federation occurring, where there are, kind of standalone authentication applications or, kind of a zone where, maybe a division of an organization or what have you are sort of ungoverned, and, try to make sure that we help people to put together kind of a strategy to bring this all together, because it's very difficult to deal with zero trust and get to least privilege when you're just trying to attack what I would call the whole Megillah, right? It's complex. It becomes difficult. Some people don't know, a certain amount of information about certain applications. They can only speak for some of it. And that's why that team is really important to be named so that we can account for everything in the enterprise. So what we do is we put that together. We look at the topology. Then we'll correct, put together what we'll call a zero trust on-ramp. One example of this is people may have new cloud applications, say it's Workday or pick your favorite flavor, and we'll basically look at that, and we'll be able to use microsegmentation to start this off in the right direction. We can still migrate the attributes and still migrate the roles that people have for other applications, but do it in a new way that adds pieces, kind of a piece at a time, to ensure that we're minimizing that privilege. So, if we just kind of migrate things as they are, we don't solve the problem, right? It's kind of like garbage in, garbage out. So it's almost like it's kind of, we help people to understand what the new kind of world will look like and how we'll move toward least privilege by dealing with each of these application assets and sort of onboarding them into the program. Not that they won't operate during that time, obviously, but this is kind of a process that we follow. And then obviously the post, the pre-analysis part kind of entails that. The post-analysis part for us basically entails recommendations, and also kind of what the 2B model should look like. So some of those recommendations would be, if you don't have 2FA in a certain area, that's a to-do. If you don't have fast provisioning capabilities from an area, that's a to-do. Maybe to leverage another tool that you have for identity provisioning, or, figuring out a better, quicker way toward governance. And then, from there, if folks, want to kind of keep moving along, we can launch zero trust activities. And those activities would be, okay, let's go through that micro-segmentation. Let's develop, the on-ramp and literally go test it, make sure that we have an absolute minimum, amount of roles involved, and then, kind of go forth and implement sort of the new technology. So from there, also, we sometimes have to define some operational changes. Somebody may be a network or sysadmin that may be taking on some more identity responsibilities, or, you may consolidate, some of your infrastructure. Through zero trust, I think if you look at it objectively, it's also an opportunity for savings at times. And if things are working well and other things aren't, obviously leveraging the things that are well can help to, kind of shore you up, and in some cases even reduce costs annually. So we do this because, the reason that we do the pre-analysis for free for folks is that we are also tied to government entities and tied to CISA and tied to, InfraGard and a number of other areas. And it's really becoming incumbent upon, I think, a lot of us to be helpful, to look at each other, almost like family now, because we're all in this together, right? I mean, yes, folks in the long run, revenue is important to a lot of them, but what's more important is that we mitigate these factors as we all kind of work together for a cleaner internet. And that's, part of what we're, focused around. So that's just a quick look at the maturity model, but, we can, if anybody is interested to ask further questions later, we can talk about specific inclusions.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I spent a lot of my career in network access control for people that have been following me, but the concept is post-authentication, we never got to the other two ways, right? Authorization and accounting. By the time people got access to networks or access to an application, they were given these privileges and access and flat networking that, they kind of overly indexed on one and not the permissions. Permissions became a huge part of what I was consulting with throughout the years at Auth0, because of so much energy being lost on the idea that you don't necessarily need admin to run a program. You need admin maybe to install a legitimate program. And so I spent so much time talking about how to limit attack breakout with identity. And I don't necessarily think I talked about it that way. I always said, software restriction policies, application restriction, segmentation, all these words that really meant you're letting users who are authorized to run apps do anything they want. And most people just think, oh, but they're base users. How bad could it be? Just as bad. So, obviously a lot of our job begins when these things sort of get loose, right, when we're actively combating an adversary at the exploit level. But I want to be clear that that the cause of a lot of these issues are not always 0 days, right? We're all somewhat patient between 0-day exploits or vulnerabilities. When a new news message hits your boss's desk that says, "Hey, there's new nickname remote code execution vulnerability. Are you able to block it? Have we patched it, etc.?" And then everybody just goes back to relaxing on the idea that we have a flat network with user credentials that can run software, right? So the concept behind zero trust and the distance to it is a new form of vulnerability advice that I hope people take the time with IntiGrow to actually assess, because it's not something that can be solved strictly through detection and response. It's a proactive activity that can't even be identified most of the time with a vulnerability scanner because it's more complex, right? But ransomware campaigns depend on access, right? They depend on persistence. Maybe there's one vulnerability that gets them in, but after that, it's a whole bunch of things that get them around, right? And so dwell time is important. Keeping them out of a system early before lateral movement is a really important thing. And this does cut down dwell time from system to system. It also cuts down lateral movement. But the idea is that a single compromise in an asset geometrically increases the likelihood they can get to another one, right? So having these things compartmentalized with the right identity profile is very key, right? Also, chances are you're not really thinking about it this way. People still think about it, vulnerabilities, alerts. Yeah, I'll get to it. I got to light up this thing for marketing. They didn't listen to me on the permissions. They get, all of our content in a syndicated database on the WordPress or something, right? And so, you have these tried traditional, pushbacks on IT and security in this environment. But I think more and more as, people demand better cybersecurity practices, they start to become aware of exactly what the challenges are and give sponsorship to those units to actually do it. What we want to do with these assessments is help you focus, right? There is more to cyber attacks than simply alerts coming out of prevention tools. There's a whole stage of the attack that is applied based on reconnaissance, right? Credentials you lose through LinkedIn, other files you may have lost through, the exploit of some other firm, right? T-Mobile, you name it, right? There's going to be a lot of areas that are, large whales that bring a lot of different data to the dark web, and then that data is for sale, right? That's the whole point of this exercise. So when we talk about our ransomware readiness assessment, the RRA from Act Zero does give you posture on what reconnaissance activity, what credentials are out there in the wild already for your firm for free in minutes, right? And the concept here is that you should be aware of this because this is how they target. This is who they focus on, is people with that initial access vector that they can jump through to the next stage. And what you're looking at here is the MITRE framework. If you think I'm talking about MITRE work on a counter or wood, please Google this because it's essential to try to map your defense strategy against this type of thing. Now, we can join, IntiGrow and Act Zero around defense evasion, right? We put a lot into our service to make sure that you can't simply disable the anti-malware programs or our agents or services with credentials that you've stolen from the customer's network, right? And so there's a lot that goes into that watchdogging and keys and all these other, ways that you can still maintain the privilege to disable something, but an attacker will have a very hard time getting around it. But getting the credentials in the first place is exactly how, defense evasion in the wide variety of attacks that we see in the news are done through credentials. So, Jim, I don't know if you want to talk about, the role of identity in defense evasion here. Yeah,
well, first of all, that's usually hardened, so we're very concerned about that. But yeah, I mean, to your point, the next gen of the tools now that are out there, kind of managing credentials now, are vastly different and much stronger than they previously were. As I mentioned, we bridge gaps between standard users and privileged users, so we don't want anyone to be able to move laterally. If you have an LDAP that has, your super admins in it, you need another plan, because that is not kind of the way to, to protect all of your assets. Because, the days of, just looking at, phishing awareness campaigns and stuff to stay away from people that might give you access to other network zones are over, right? So the defense evasion here for us is, making sure that those users do have least privilege, making sure that even if we need to go back and look at the entire framework of what the attributes are that are associated with each user, we'll do so. If anybody has any history of any type of breach or phishing attack or brute force kind of attack, we'll go through and kind of, re-look at that to make sure that that's not capable of happening again. And, really from this perspective, Act Zero handles all the last mile kind of stuff, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure by kind of re-looking at this. And you'd be surprised how simple, some people's identity kind of frameworks really are. I mean, and they're maybe 10 years old or they're 15 years old. In the very same way that we use password vaulting now and other things, a lot of folks I don't have to kind of go through the whole sharing passwords and reusing passwords and that whole thing. But, those days are numbered. And, now that we're coming into a new generation and a dawn of much more complex potential attacks, as I said, we're all very concerned about quantum on the horizon and some other things. This defense evasion, hardening those identity assets, ensuring that they are least privilege focused, that they are zone segmented, et cetera, are mission critical to kind of the evasion tactics that we use to kind of maximize your opportunity to be successful.
Yeah, a good joke that I heard was your identity, framework should be just checking into junior kindergarten at best. If it's old enough to drive, you're going to crash. If it's old enough to drink, you're really going to crash.
That's well said.
Keep those things that were based on 2000, 2003. If it's got the same LDAP schema as it did when it was X400, we probably need to advance that to the SaaS, to the SAML, to the APIs, and to the clouds and other things that do talk about these principles. Now, obviously, the test that we're going to run is to say, well, they have to put ransomware in the net, right? The last stage here, impact, very important to encrypting files, because that's really when they can make you cry uncle, is when you no longer have access to anything on your systems. And so the idea here is that there's a lot of different ways that the assessment will use the last most relevant, most newsworthy campaign strategies from the attacker to test your defenses, right? So we test about 75 right now, 76, right? It changes every week as new campaigns and new techniques come in there. But the idea is that they're going to go from 1 to 11 over and over and over again, and they're going to change the techniques to do that, right? And so the ransomware assessment really is to understand how they're playing this game, right? Is that they keep tweaking the ways that they can stay in the environment, change these tactics and techniques. And I'll tell you about our assessment and how long it takes, but how long it takes for an attacker to go from asset A to asset B, the time you're trying to beat, is roughly 98 minutes, right? That's how long the average breakout time is from initial access to the next asset. And then it geometrically decreases from there to go to asset C, D, E, F exponentially, like a fission reaction, right? The longer they can persist in the environment, the greater the likelihood is that they're going to be able to do this. Right? We got to get them out early. The more they can study, the more opportunities they have, the more entry points they have, the more systems they have, the simpler it's going to be to wait for you to go to bed and try to hit that, right? Of course, with a service like ours, et cetera, we'll plug ourselves later. But the concept is that that's a key aspect to your security defenses, right? And there's one metric for success. How many assets am I going to be able to have encrypted? That's the likelihood that they're going to pay me, right? Meanwhile, on the other side, IT has a very different view of the world, right? Going through tabletops, known scenarios, well prepared from 9 to 5. Our recovery mode and our backups are our last bastion of hope that we're going to be able to survive a ransomware attack. So we just all kind of wait for the day that we're going to be basically on a packing weekend, come in and rebuild our entire network from scratch. And the idea is that our security roadmaps are always built around what's new, what's fascinating, what our friends say, as opposed to actual KPIs that give you, a notice of what's going on, right? And I can think of why this assessment strategy typically gets lost on most people. If I ask the people on the call what their current block rate is, they probably wouldn't know. The reason is they don't have a way to measure it. They can't simulate dark web attacks, not really, right? They might be simulating MITRE, they might be simulating ICAR viruses, they might be looking for an alert to get to another person, but they're not necessarily setting off a bunch of trees falling in the woods to see just how many they would actually catch, right? And this is a critical part of evaluating your security program. Endpoint, 100%, and in other places, of course, right? The dwell time is also important. Understand that you're not gonna have a block rate of 100%. If somebody says that, they're just not testing thoroughly, right? And we can demonstrate that. We don't tell people our block rate's 100%. We'd never have to do any of the other stuff if that was true, right? If we look at the dwell time rate, this is gonna be non-zero. How long can this attacker and attack persist in the environment as a credentialed user before they actually go and get to the next asset? What systems do you have in place to curtail that activity? And this is exactly what the test does, our examination, right? The signal to noise ratio is also really important, right? Because a tree falling in the woods is great, but if 500 trees fall and you can only listen to 2 of them without looking at the entire forest, you're never going to get the actual key of what to do. So understanding that you need accurate collated signal to tell somebody, hey, contain a notification, this is what's going on. Picture's worth 1,000 words is probably worth 100,000 events, right? And so we want to make sure that people understand what their signal to noise ratio is, because it's key in the actual events starting before incident response, right? Without the right picture, it's going to be very hard to deploy countermeasures, that may be even manual at some point, right? So notifications, of course, are going to have to distribute to other stakeholders. So it's important to understand that the testing for elite SOC teams starts with these 3 very critical aspects. This is what our assessment is. It is free. Please ask us for one. And the idea is that after that, you have to be continuously doing this in your SOC. Gone are the days that a machine that you've set a year ago is going to set a critical alert that's going to be responded to in 15 minutes. You need to constantly adjust the policy here by testing these new techniques. They change every 24 hours to get around this. So the idea of real world automatic testing based on real actual attacks is what an MDR service is about. We've been processing this for years about AI, data science, and security engineering working together to test real stuff against your policy and see where there needs to be adjustments. And the leftovers becoming threat hunting and hardening, right? When we look at that, that's going to cover defense in depth. If you understand how the layers work together, you understand there's a certain number of things you can't block at the network level. It's not feasible. The file's too big. The process is dual encrypted. There's a very whitelisty approach to 443. We've all seen that, right? So understanding the limitations of these and understanding the testing required, very key to the assessment, right? And something that we want to obviously talk to teams about constantly, because we've spent our career talking about endpoint network and cloud. Now, the last thing is you don't have to buy these tests, right? A lot of these tests they exist. You just need a good practitioner to do them. That's why we're offering it for free, right? Is that not that the software that we use is free or anything like that, but the idea is that this is quick and easy. An attacker can get in your environment, spread around in an hour and 38 minutes. Our assessment takes about the same, and it should take less, right? It should take less. So the idea is that it's quick and easy. There's no cost, no commitment. We can do it in an hour. We can do the actual customer-involved endpoint-to-endpoint test in an hour, right? And the idea is that then you can measure your block rate, dwell time, signal to noise ratio on what you've already purchased, right? And we're hoping that what you find is a good number, right? That you've validated that your practices are in place and working correctly. Then we're going to talk about the dark web just to give you an idea of the credential exposure, right? And that's where we sort of hand off, right? We're looking to IntiGrow to give us, once the account's been compromised, what is the validity of that account in terms of accessing the entire network? What is that adaptive control you've implemented? How far are they going to get? If you have no zero trust, one credential compromise means access to everything. Distance to zero trust, you shouldn't have that exposure mean a lot when it actually goes down, right? So we'll tell you the reconnaissance part, and then they'll of course talk about the zero trust part. So Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about how to get involved with the zero trust assessment?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I think the one thing to remember is that we're all in this together. If you're part of FBI InfraGard, if you're part of DoD Advisory, if you're part of, if you work actively with CISA, and by the way, for some of you out there, there are free assets like certain application pen testing and things like that. If you notify, for most states, you notify your regional office. If you're not aware of that, those assets are there in some cases, and I'm a kind of a member of that as well. But that's another, kind of overarching kind of feel that we all have right now. We do the zero trust assessment, kind of the pre-assessment at no cost and no commitment to ensure that we help people to start thinking about how they need to be thinking if they're not there yet, right? We talked about, again, I already went through this. I don't need to bore everybody with all the detail, but team formulation is key, and who will own that within the organization. What methodologies are being deployed, or what is the workflow right now for provisioning and deployment of assets and applications. That's mission critical. We do, again, kind of an architecture review. If you don't have topology put together today, sometimes, or have partial, sometimes we can kind of help, spur that on through discussion and working with the team. And as Adam just so eloquently put, I mean, the distance to zero trust is really important because, what we've found is there are some organizations that are wantonly going after it. There are some that are decent at it, and there are some that don't know how to go about kind of putting those pieces together, or maybe don't have all of the the bandwidth or capability or even political gravitas that they might need. Sometimes a third party can be helpful with that when we say, we're here to, help everybody work together to make sure that, y'all are safe. So, that's really the zero trust assessment in a nutshell. We can help you, simply by an email if somebody's, very concerned about anonymity or anything else. We're happy to sign a non-disclosure agreement and kind of make this happen as we've done for many others and continue to do in both, as I said, kind of the public and private sectors. So it's a pretty simple process, really. Again, I do underscore the fact that we're all in this together. I think if you go to ISACs and things like that, you see that there's a lot more collaboration and cooperation these days than ever before. We have things like Project Shield, which is kind of a national initiative for standards and everybody to kind of work together. CISA is now putting the list of, all APT, newly developed threats, potential compromise areas, patches, shortages, all of that is cataloged now on the CISA.gov site. If you haven't looked at that in a while, you may want to take a look. Patching is not always a perfect science, and more things are being exploited every day. Now hackers are having competitions right in front of us around the world, to kind of get into our core assets. So, and they're kind of waving it in our faces by winning prizes. So, it's really time that we all locked arms, I think, and helped each other. And that's why we're really in this. So.
Thanks, Jim. On that note, I'm going to talk a little bit about the resources we left behind. If you don't feel like this assessment's right for you, at least check the resources to see, how to get started with us. We're not asking for a commitment. We're able to do this quickly. It's very valuable insight in terms of your current security posture. So we are hoping that you do. But in the interim, if you're also looking to implement, incident response, and you believe that you're going to get the signal you need from your tools, then there's the Foundations for Incident Response white paper we also built. We've also developed a sample report for you to understand exactly what you're going to see when the assessment is complete, so that you're not wondering, just exactly how this is going to be formulated on paper when over. So we're going to turn it over to Q&A before we close. We've got a number of different questions in here, a whole bunch of live viewers. So let me look through a few of these. Here's one about what is PAM, PAM, and how does it play into this? I'll pass that over to you, Jim, I think.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, we use way too many acronyms all the time, and I apologize if I've done so. PAM, in this case, privilege access management, involves usually a solution that kind of governs all network and application authentication and access. So the privileged users, when logging in, will be able to see each other working online. The privileged access management, or PAM solutions, now do things like provide transparency for all admins. So if others are logged in, we can see each other. There are other things that we have, like session monitoring, where we're able to kind of see where we're all going, what we're having access to. It's not really watching over the shoulder. It's really more being able to detail what has occurred in the event that we ever did have a challenge of any type. Also, quite frankly, I mean, in one privilege case, I've seen in a kind of a banking scenario, somebody was accessing an accounts payable module in SAP, and it's kind of like, why are you doing that? You're supposed to be provisioning network access. So, it helps us to kind of govern each other. The other thing that it does is, in the event that something did occur, a session recording is often set so that we can kind of, do recon and sort of figure out, sort of what transpired, and which helps a lot with limitation of liability issues. I can tell you that insurance rating organizations like this too. It is part of the standard for the kill chain now, and especially for medium or larger organizations, it's obviously mission critical and best practice these days. So that's kind of the PAM thing.
I think the times that I heard about it, it was usually, hey, there's a cyber insurance questionnaire, and they've got this PAM there. But I've also got multi-factor authentication, and I've got identity and access management. So for the viewers out there, what's kind of the difference there, would you say? Because I hear them kind of conflated all the time. What's the difference between MFA, IAM, and PAM?
Yeah, so multi-factor authentication, obviously, as we talked about, you're authenticating, you're using a tool. I won't even push any brands, right? But you're using a tool that has that you're using their reverse proxy going through. As soon as it sees your attribute, it allows you in, and then auto generates, kind of that token back to you in terms of, however you have it set up. Probably to SMS to your phone right now to get that token, or you may have a token app on your phone, or you may have a hard token. Some people still have. So we've done that kind of thing even with biometrics, where it requires that 2FA to be your fingerprint, can be your, in certain places, facial recognition, although, as most of us know, identity providers do not accept face as an official form of authentication for anything official or governed or critical infrastructure related. But yeah, that the MFA, the multi-factor authentication part, kind of is that way. And that's the one I'm talking about there. IAM obviously is identity and access management. So identity tools that provision, that store users, that also usually the access part of that will have what we'll call the reverse proxy that they can log into. There are tool makers that kind of provide those together. There are ones that provide them separately out there or as a service. And then also that authentication part and the access part often contains the federation component. So where we're passing the SAML certification along firewall to doubly make sure, like 2FA, that the user is who they say they are, right? So that SAML cert is a little bit of code that's generated. You can spot it in the HTTP header when you're changing from one firewall to another. And federation is really widely used, probably more than most people realize. My own personal banking account, for example, I log in, I go from one place to another. I look around, my accounts and things. But if I am, in fact, going to go look at the financial instruments available to me or anything else, I click a button, it federates me from one location to another location and their firewall. So happens all the time, every day, to almost every one of us. So, and then obviously the privileged aspect is keeping aside from standard identity users are the super admins, the admins, the folks that hold the keys to things that could do potential damage. And totally different strategy, different tool set, but that kind of how those three break out.
Yeah, I think part of the assessment too can help you answer questions like these a little bit more in detail, right? Because when we talk about adaptive control, many of these systems are actually working either in concert. Are they different products? It helps to say, like, in your environment, is this all possible with what you already have? Do you need something else, right? It helps to just clarify, because I think that people will sometimes Google things and then say, these are 5 attributes, and then deploy. And they'll miss the whole point of, like, privileged access management is to secure admins. And they'll just say, well, am I securing my admins in the domain controller with the super admins like we talked about? So that's helpful. I think we have a couple more minutes. There's probably 1 or 2 in here left. But please, if you guys have questions live, please do it. So here's one. Does the zero trust assessment use live malware? So I think here, I'll shoot for this one. So the risk assessment, the ransomware readiness assessment that we're doing leverages simulations, right? We try to be as accurate as possible. It's still going to set off the anti-malware products and things that you have, because these are actions that people take that, are used in these campaigns that typically should set off an alarm because they are malicious. But a lot of these attacks, are not necessarily the virus itself, right? So we could encrypt files in a bunch of different ways, not necessarily having to deploy the executable that matches the virus, that was out on the dark web. Of course, we have in production a whole bunch of malware that, gets updated very frequently, and variants of it. So, if that's something that you're interested in viewing and understanding as part of the service, a safer way to be maybe engage in a demo, and we can show you some real tough stuff hitting the wire. But yeah, I'd say that in the assessments, it does not use live malware. These are simulations, but they should reflect the real world. They'll still encrypt the files.
Yeah. I think it also depends if you're talking about the planning zero trust aspect of this or the kind of last mile act zero kind of aspect of it, right?
Exactly.
So,
on the zero trust assessment, I guess you are leveraging their production systems to ask them questions. It's not all hypothetical, obviously.
Right.
Yeah. We've got 5 more minutes. Let me just look at another one here. Okay. We talked about block rate and how about the defenses I'm using aren't blocking what hackers are doing. How can you say you're blocking when my next gen AV, EDR, SIM can't? Right, I think sometimes you conflate the question with like, how are you better than that, right? And I think that, especially when you trust these brands inherently with your security, the idea is that you trust them to act appropriately in all the situations. These tools were not designed. This is not the manufacturer standard for them to catch every single admin activity that's going on the operating system and block them. They're there to catch exploit activity, malware activity. And they give you the analytics in the EDR, the recording, the flight recorder in the SIM to investigate if that signal that's been given through the exploit has other activities around it, right? And so our job at Act Zero is to block those activities, the malicious admin activities that these typical tools do not, right? Using machine learning and AI science. And the idea is it increases your block rate on the objectives, right? The things they do before the ransomware is deployed. Right, so it's important to understand those are not how the tools were designed. They were not. This is why MDR exists. If they were designed to block everything in the world, you would just have an admin nightmare of whitelisting things you actually use, and not every single command variant that would come out of PowerShell. Right, so that really is how and why the service is constructed and the assessment is constructed to show you the objectives that can sail right through your existing AV and SIM with very little lookup from other teams without that added value. So we're going to wrap here. We only have a couple minutes left. You can please provide feedback and rate us. Jim, I'll turn it over to you for closing thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar today.
Oh, the pleasure's mine. I guess to wrap up, I would like to say one more time, we are all in this together. If there are things that you think can be helpful these days, don't be afraid to ask people for help. There are a lot of resources out there. None of us, or as I like to say in our organization, all of us knows more than any of us. And I do think that, there is some value that you can gain from here. Yeah, there are times when we'll go on to kind of work with people, and there are times we don't. So really, but helping them to start thinking about how to simplify and get toward least privilege, which is definitely a journey, for certain size organizations, not a destination. It takes time, it takes patience and discipline, but it really pays off in the end. And, I think if you really know what's going on out there right now and how many organizations are having how many problems that they're really having, it's definitely worth using those resources. But we are grateful for your time and use the resources available. Even if we can help you find other resources, we're happy to do that as well. So thanks, John.
And for those of you that are joining us live and watching this, July 28th, I just want to remind you guys that we'll be at Black Hat on August 10th and 11th at the Mandalay Bay Casino, and we are booth 1787. Please stop by. We can walk you through exactly how the assessment works, give you a demo of it live, and obviously chat about your security concerns, including identity, while you're there. So thanks so much for joining us. Much appreciated again to the IntiGrow team and Jim for joining us as well. Go.actzero.ai/RRA to get started with the risk assessment. And we'll hope to chat to you soon. Thanks, everyone.